Welcome and thank you for joining me. I am Verone and this is Just Another Voice. I don't know if I will be saying anything here that hasn't been said more eloquently by many others or that won't just be considered common sense to most, but I had fun thinking about this and figured it was the kind of thing to make a video about. That's the type of thing I do here, though I do try to make sure I have something worth saying in every video I upload. So if you like what you see, please like, subscribe, and share this video with anyone you know would enjoy it. Note, I will be talking primarily in the context of the visual medium in this video, and the language I choose to use throughout will reflect that, though the principles discussed may be applied across fiction. We are all impressed by the extraordinary. It is the things that go beyond the day-to-day and defy our expectations of probability that blow our minds. We love watching things that surpass what we expect from reality. It's why we immerse ourselves in escapism in the first place. And we continually seek for bigger thrills, more incredible feats in our entertainment to make us jump, gasp, and cheer. But we've all seen plenty of things in our films that just make us laugh. And not because they try to. They're meant to be awesome, but rather than stun us, they just amuse us. If they don't just bore us. But why? What's the difference? Let me turn to a moment from The Avengers. Hawkeye is firing off arrow after arrow at aliens almost casually, each hitting its target flawlessly. It's decently impressive, I suppose. It's showing us what an incredible archer Clint is. But then he does something that, at least for me, totally breaks any sense of awesomeness this scene might have had, as he effortlessly unleashes an arrow at a target without even looking. Why does this fail to stun me? Isn't it even more impressive a feat than everything else he's done previously? Why am I no longer impressed? If you know anything about writing already, you should be familiar with the concept of suspension of disbelief, the ability of the viewer to subconsciously accept the unbelievable. Well, this moment broke my suspension of disbelief. I could accept that this guy could fire off arrows with aim and precision that would be nothing short of superhuman in reality, considering the tone and setting of the movie, but without any actual power explaining what sixth sense allows him to shoot targets he can't see, I just can't believe that that shot is possible. And thereafter, nothing he did was that impressive because I know it's not like he even has to look to make every shot. Thus, the key to awesomeness is that while it must push our ability to believe what we are seeing, it must not break it. I could end the video there, but the world of fiction is complicated, so I'll try to extrapolate and explain how to implement this idea in a variety of settings. Suspension of disbelief is necessary to keep the audience buying ridiculousness, and thus being impressed by it. You need to keep what you want to be impressive just within the realms of believability of your world, but you can theoretically push the limits of those realms as far as you want for any story. I said that with the Avengers, I can accept Hawkeye's aim while I might not be able to in the context of a more grounded film. If you establish a certain expectation for what is believable within your story, you can work within that, but when you break that suspension of disbelief by suddenly pushing it way too far, it'll be hard to regain that, and your audience will no longer be impressed by ridiculousness in your story. Be warned, the farther you push suspension of disbelief, the less of a reaction you'll get for awesomeness, as the more your brains are taught to accept, the harder it is to impress it. The Fast and Furious franchise is a great example of suspension of disbelief being pushed to the point where just about anything is acceptable within the rules of the world. We don't question cars leaping between buildings and parachuting from planes because we've been taught to accept that sort of thing. However, this comes at the cost of not being as awesome as it could be because it's not testing believability in any way, as we've been taught to accept the most unbelievable things already. And some won't be able to get on board in the first place because it's just pushing their suspension of disbelief farther than they can let it go. Thus, the key to the incredible, being as impressive as possible, is keeping suspension of disbelief as low as possible, convincing the brains of the audience that what they are watching is as real as possible. The more they believe they are watching reality, the more they can be wowed by epic stunts. Let's go back to Hawkeye. Even removing shots like the total suspension of disbelief breaking no-looking shot I mentioned earlier, his aim is established to be so perfect that we are continually impressed by it, since it's what we've been taught is normal in this world, and it leads to the filmmakers breaking our suspension of disbelief in their attempts to wow us. However, if his abilities were more realistic and didn't stretch our suspension of disbelief quite so far, if it was just established that he was even capable of missing, his shot would be more impressive, because our suspension of disbelief wouldn't be stretched so far already. I just want to make it clear that suspension of disbelief is not as simple as a vertical scale. We can be made to believe pretty incredible things while still having an overall low suspension of disbelief for the story. You can introduce the magic system or some other fantastical element into the world, but if everything outside of that one established fantastic element operates according to normal laws of reality, and particularly if that element feels a part of the setting, we can still keep a pretty low suspension of disbelief. Most people talk about superhero films and brush off any ludicrous happenings within them because they're operating in worlds where people can fly and shoot lasers from their eyes, so what's to find outrageous? But different superhero films have different levels of believability that don't necessarily correlate to the craziness of the science fiction within the films. Man of Steel has some of the most outlandish science fiction with the Kryptonians' abilities and technology, but because the fantasticality is limited to the aliens, and the human world looks and feels as completely real as it is possible to be in a superhero film, and because the aliens still appear to follow the laws of physics to a degree in the way they move with their abilities, grounding them in this grounded world, it has a far lower overall suspension of disbelief than many superhero films with far less outlandish premises. So you can have some crazy, outlandish ideas in your stories, but if you define the extraordinary elements and keep the extraordinariness contained, and keep the setting within which all these crazy things happen very grounded, you can still have a low suspension of disbelief for everything outside of that fantastic element. But going even farther, giving those extraordinary elements rules and boundaries so that you and the viewer understand how they operate can make the brain believe them even more firmly grounding those elements within the setting and making your brain believe them. We like things to make sense, and a key, if not the key, to believability is logic and consistency. If you write fantasy, you may be familiar with Brandon Sanderson's first law of magic, which says that your ability to solve problems in your story with magic in a satisfying way is directly proportional to how well the reader understands said magic. If I may take the liberty of extrapolating and adapting that principle, the degree to which your audience must stretch their suspension of disbelief to accept your magic or otherwise extraordinary element of your story is inversely proportional to how well they understand said element. Much less elegant, I know, but I hope it conveys the principle well enough. However, even when your magic or otherwise fantastic element allows for it, you must always be cautious of blatantly breaking basic laws of physics, particularly in a way that may not feel deliberate, especially when you've already established a low suspension of disbelief. There is an uncanny valley in which our brains know that what we're seeing is wrong and rejects it. One great example of a stunt from a movie that is so ridiculous that I doubt more than 1% of the audience didn't laugh at it is Legolas's rock jumping stunt in the Battle of the Five Armies. This moment has become such an iconic example of laughable stunts that I had to include it in the thumbnail of this video. There are a few lessons we can learn from this. Admittedly, this kind of thing is perfectly within the established level of believability of the Hobbit movies, but because that level of believability is so much more ridiculous than that of the very grounded Lord of the Rings films that preceded them, all these things seem so much more ridiculous in comparison, so we can learn about keeping believability consistent across the franchise. But even within the Hobbit movies, it's potentially the most blatant middle finger to physics. Not even necessarily the most egregious in my opinion, but with the dramatic focus on it with the slow-mo and everything, it's impossible to miss. And so it, of course, teaches that flagrantly throwing physics to the wind and how things move will trigger something in our brains and immediately break suspension of disbelief. But the most interesting thing about this example is that it is explainable within the rules of the world. The Lord of the Rings establishes that elves have very low body mass or are able to defy gravity somehow when it's shown that Legolas is able to effortlessly walk on the surface of snow. So this bit, jumping on the falling stones, should make sense, right? Well, it just goes to show how ingrained our laws of physics are, and how we will subconsciously reject anything that so blatantly breaks them. But can we mess with the laws of physics in a world and have it be believable? Well, to answer that, we need look no farther than cartoons. I find it interesting that animated films seem to operate with their own laws of physics, not completely disregarding them, but greatly exaggerating them. People don't really move like animated characters at all, and we certainly can't survive as much as them. You can pull all sorts of stuff in a cartoon. that you would never be able to buy in a live action, but our brains don't question it. It seems you can invent your very own laws of physics upon which everything in your film operates, but I believe the key here is consistency. Sure, being animated lends itself to some liberty on the part of our brains, which already recognize they're not watching reality, but I think you can play with physics in live action if you convince the audience that the characters really do operate under different laws of physics. For the most part, Legolas appears to move like any other human being, so when he suddenly appears to defy gravity, it just looks weird, and our brains don't buy it. So, yeah, consistency is key. And that all comes back to the original point about believability. Our suspension of disbelief requires that we give our brains a certain expectation, a subconscious understanding of how this world operates. It's when we suddenly break that expectation that the scene loses any credibility, and in so doing, any awesomeness it might have had. So, there we go. That is my commentary on the relationship between believability and awesomeness in fiction. I hope you liked what you heard and will offer your own insight in the comments below. That's where the real intelligent discussion happens. I'm just trying to kick it off here. Anyway, I really hope to see you in the next video, and until then, never stay silent.